Thank you. I'm also really glad I looked at the official version of the proceedings because I thought my talk was at 4:30. So if there's a little panic here, it's just because it's not an important thing. I want to start out by saying that beer has food value, but food has no beer value. Okay? This is one of those things that is just a truism amongst home brewers in particular. My husband is a home brewer. He's won prizes for his beers and especially for his hard ciders. We have close to 200 apple trees that he has planted that are mostly of heirloom varieties developed solely for cider. In fact, he told me about one today that he just realized makes a fruit that is completely inedible. An inedible apple is strange to me, but it is important for fragrance and some notes in ciders. So your standard orchard apples are not what you make cider with ordinarily. So anyway, because he's the beer guy, we're both archaeologists. I've taken an interest in what he's been learning as a new subject, and I was interested in how to tell if any prehistoric ceramics from anywhere in the world had ever been used in conjunction with making beer. We know that we can do this with wine because wine residues accumulate in the bottom of bottles of old wines in particular. I think they probably filter things now. Your next speaker can fill you in on this. But the crystals in the bottom of these old bottles of wine are called winestone, but actually they're tartaric acid, or as we use in the kitchen, cream of tartar. So if you have a vessel that has got tartaric acid crystals in it, then that bottle was used to hold wine at some point. And I was curious about, well, why is everybody talking about wine? What about beer, the people's drink? How do we know if beer was ever around? I did start doing some research, and I have an entire PowerPoint talk, which of course is not going to happen. But in Egypt, for instance, there is from studies that people have done there's the concept of bread as solid beer. When you bake up a loaf of bread, you have all the ingredients in that loaf that is needed to make beer. And I have this image of taking a loaf of bread, breaking it in pieces, putting it in a pot, pouring in some water, and stand back as over a couple of days it turns into beer because everything it needs is there, including the yeast, which actually is magically in the air everywhere you are. This room is full of yeast molecules up there, organisms. And they drift around. And if they fall on something wet, especially with a lot of water, like a semi-liquid, then they're happy and they start multiplying. And what they're doing is consuming the starch molecules that are in that liquid. And there are well, first off, your organisms of fermentation encompass both fungi and bacteria. So you have a whole host of little microscopic invisible critters that are out there helping to break things down from one thing to another. And the thing that has to happen to make fermentation happen is that the starch molecules are very long. Let's just say they're very long. And there are enzymes that attack certain points in these long chain carbohydrates to break them into shorter long chains of carbohydrates. And then another enzyme will come along and clip that one into yet a shorter one. And finally it gets down to the really short ones that the other organisms can then convert into sugar. Then that sugar is used by, yet again, other organisms as food. And they digest that sugar, keep themselves alive, multiply. And as their waste products, they produce alcohol and gas. Now, the alcohol is obviously the part that's of interest to beer, but the gas is of interest to bread makers. If you've ever made sourdough bread, or made a starter from a recipe in a book, basically you'll take some flour and some water, maybe some sugar. You really don't need the sugar, but you can throw it in there. And you whomp it up in a jar or a bowl, and you just let it sit in the air. And when it starts, not if, when it starts to bubble, then you've got your starter started, and then you start caring for this stuff in the refrigerator to lengthen its life cycle. You'll take out portions of this to mix up with yet more flour, and then sugar and flavorings and things like that. You can make flapjacks if you want to pour your sourdough mix onto a griddle. If you want to mix in enough solids to make it more like a loaf of bread, you can do that. But this then gets us back to the idea of bread as solid beer. When you're just learning to homebrew, there are still recipes out there that will say, okay, take some bread yeast and put it in this container with your beer stuff, and when it ferments, then you'll have beer. Well, bread yeast has been selected over centuries for the flavors and reactivity that those specific bread organisms have to flour. So it's probably a maximum of gas and maybe a minimum of alcohol. And it's one of these interesting things. The alcohol that these organisms produce as part of their life cycle is actually fatal to them. So that's why, as a home brewer, you typically can't get a beer of, say, more than 9% alcohol unless you have very special yeast, because the yeast kill themselves off. Well, and this is part of the domestication of yeast. My husband is convinced that yeast was the first domesticated entity in the world. And it was done over and over and over all around the world. Wherever you have fermentation, which is everywhere, then you have distinctions of collections of bacteria and fungi that are good for certain purposes. You have bread yeast, you have quick rise, you got regular rise, you got the little wet tablets, you got the powder. That's just for bread. And then for your beers, you've got top fermenting ale yeast, where your yeast stays on top of the fluid. And then you have bottom rising, or bottom feeding isn't right, but bottom bottom fermenting. Bottom fermenting yeasts, and they make a big deposit on the bottom of your carboy where you're making your beer. And then there are yeasts that have been designed for working in cold. Your lagered beers are always fermented in a very, very cold, almost to freezing, and it takes a special yeast to withstand that cold temperature. Your ale yeast take heat, and so there's a big difference between ale and lagers, and beer people out here know this. But that has to do with the domestication and the selection of yeasts over centuries for characteristics that pleased either the brewer or made it possible to make beer in a given location, given environmental conditions. Now, you might think that beers only use domesticated yeast anymore, and that's not quite true. Belgian beers, and I have forgotten the name, somebody out there can chime in and tell me what it is a specific type of Belgian beer, made only in Belgium, is produced by putting out trays or big shallow vats of wort, which is your boiled grain mixture, your barley and your water. And you boil it to kill all the yeast and stuff that came with the barley, right? So you have a sterile solution here. You lay it out in these trays up in these attics of these raftered old buildings that have the ends with louvers that open and shut. So they put the beer out there in these shallow trays, and at night they open the louvers so the wind comes through. And apparently at night, the specific yeast that they want to make this beer with is available, but not in the daytime. And it falls in these trays, so when morning comes, they shut the louvers, they siphon the stuff down and put it in a fermentation tank, and it has the right yeast to produce this particularly flavored Belgian beer. And that's wild. The thing is, it's in the attics of these old buildings, and they won't tear these buildings down. They won't clean them. They won't do anything because it's just right. Whatever it is just right. And I think that's kind of interesting. Let me see. We talked about the enzymes breaking the starches. I didn't tell you that sprouting the seeds that you're going to brew into beer, for your classical beers, it's only barley. But you can put other grains in there. Your Wit beers have wheat, and Budweiser's got rice, and various other grains that are used for flavor and mouthfeel in beers. But part of that process, actually the beginning of that process, is to malt the seed, the grain. And malting is nothing more than sprouting the seed. So you have to have a live seed, but you moisten it and let it be in a moist place for a couple days, and they will sprout, and a little sprout will come out. As part of that sprouting process, the seed itself, the embryo inside that seed, has produced enzymes that have already started to break down those long starch chains into shorter sugar chains. And so that is all you need, that and the yeast in the air, to make beer happen. So malted barley, you all hear about this in all the beer ads. Well, it wouldn't be beer if it wasn't for malted barley. And so it's these enzymes that you need to help you get along with the process. You can malt and ferment just about anything. Barley, wheat, saguaro fruit, agave, corn. That's just by design. Now, I've had the orange juice go to alcohol in the refrigerator. And there's probably some other things that y'all have experienced in the magic of the refrigerator over time. My understanding is that taste is your guide, but that basically if something has fermented, and I'm not clear where the dotted line between fermented, rotten, or spoiled and then rotten is, but that's a continuum of the decomposition of the organic molecules in this soup that the yeast has fallen into. My understanding is that if it's been through some sort of fermentation, it won't kill you. And it was this, take that with a grain of salt. It was this principle that kept medieval Europe alive, because by the Middle Ages, they had so polluted their water sources that nobody drank water. They drank beer. And it's because by rotting this water with barley and yeast and everything else, the product at the end, run through this filter of yeast and such, was wholesome and safe to drink. So it wasn't considered a recreational beverage, it was a safe beverage. Nobody drank water, because that was just, asking for it. So fermented foods, lots of foods that are important to people in this room are fermented and you wouldn't think about it. Coffee, black tea, chocolate, pickles, cheese, and all kinds of dairy products, including yogurt, beer and wine. And if you ever make wine at home, I use a recipe from Mrs. Robert E. Lee for wild grapes, and you put these, mash these grapes up, put them in a crock, put a cheesecloth over the thing, and just let it be on the counter until it starts turning into wine, and it will. And the trick is it's the continuum again between fermentation, spoiling, and rotten. Because if it goes all the way to the end, you'll have vinegar. Very nice vinegar, but it won't be the wine you were hoping for. So country wines take wild yeast, and the other folk drinks that you think about or that you've heard about, like pulque in Mexico, made from agave, aguamiel, and chicha, made in Peru from chewed corn, also use the wild yeasts. And we already mentioned sourdough. So, chicha. Chicha has always had a kind of a fascination for me. It's a repulsive, attractive fascination. Because ladies will take ground corn and chew it and then spit it into a vessel. And you'll do this all day long until your allotment of corn that you're going to make chicha from has been passed through the mouth and into the pot. Now, it turns out they're not actually chewing to bits. The corn, they're moistening it with saliva, and that may involve a certain amount of chewing-like action, but they're not actually grinding this up between their teeth. What's happening is that the saliva has the same enzymes in it as does the sprouting endosperm, the embryo in a corn kernel. So by moistening the corn with saliva, it jumpstarts the breaking of the long carbohydrate chain into smaller chains than that the wild yeast that falls into the pot can work on to turn this stuff into alcohol. And I'll tell you, all of these wild yeast products that I've played with have very, very low amounts of alcohol. It might be 1%. So this is not something that gets you rip-roaring at any time fast. But it's also a little on the sweet side. But again, it's that continuum. Depends on where there you get it. I've let the time pass too quickly and sampled things more on the rotten end. It's still alcohol, it just doesn't taste good at all. So that's chicha. Pulque is made in northern Mexico from the juice of the agave, the maguey. We were supposed to have maguey to taste yesterday afternoon, but it apparently spoiled before we could have it served, and that's part of that continuum. But when the agave plant is about to reproduce, send up the giant flower stalk in the middle, the people are watching these plants. They know when they're about to send this stalk up. So as it starts to come up, they'll cut it off, and the plant doesn't know any better, and it keeps sending up all of this carbohydrate fluid from the roots, and it collects in the well that's been created in the rosette of the maguey by having cut off the flower stalk. And it comes out by the gallon. And people will gather this up and take it home. It's called agua miel, or honey water. And that will readily ferment into a refreshing, ever so slightly effervescent, low alcohol summer drink. Now, pulque is important today even, because it's the predecessor to, it's the first step into getting mezcal. So the agua miel is fermented and fermented out, and then it's distilled into mezcal, which is also then further distilled into tequila. So wild yeast is at the base of all of that. And then the Tarahumara Indians in northern Mexico make a thing called Tesuino. It's also called Tesuino. There's probably some other ways of spelling it and saying it. This is the one that they make from corn kernels. They'll take a sack of corn and moisten it and put it behind the stove where it's warm and wait for it to sprout. And once it's sprouted, then they'll take it onto a metate, grind it into a pulp, add that to a jar, pour some water in it. And they understand that the jar is critical to the fermentation process, but the idea of the microorganisms that are caught in the tiny pores on the inside of the pot is not necessarily obvious to anybody. So what they'll do is use seasoned Tesuino jars to make the Tesuino, but then they'll take a new Tesuino jar and put it next to the one that's working, so the first one can teach the second one how it works. And I think that's a wonderful piece of intuition, because the yeast that's falling into the real fermentation jar, as well as captured in the pores, the interstices of the ceramic interior, that new pot is going to accumulate that same yeast that's falling in the air in that spot. That one ferments for a couple of days, and then it's drunk quickly because it spoils quickly. And I have not had real Tesuino. I'm told it's interesting. I have my own versions that I created as part of an experiment, trying to generate residues of beer in ceramic vessels, to answer my original question of 10 minutes ago. So, in this experiment, at this point I'm supposed to say, beer is liquid cereal. So, all of you that indulge in the Breakfast of Champions, you're actually doing a good thing. What I've concluded from my experiments, which involved making pottery, firing that pottery, and then using that pottery to, as a fermentation vessel for 5 variations of wild yeast, tame yeast, sprouted corn, unsprouted corn, salud, everything I could think of. My conclusion there is that there's not one thing that we're looking for like there is with wine. You have tartrates, you got wine. And the spectrum of organic species is the technical term for the results from this scientific work. I was able to have a scientist at Sandia Labs help me out with this. And his thing was spectrophotometry, and I think that's right. Salud. Gosh. And it has delayed my publication of these results, trying to weed out all the things that are not associated with fermentation, and I have those data from everything else that's left. I was really looking for one thing that would tell me beer, and it's not going to be that way. But it does illustrate all of this talking here, that beer is something I had to learn to like, and that's odd, but it truly is the people's drink, because anybody can make beer. You won't make very good beer, but you will be able to drink what you do make. And it'll be safe for you. And the world of fermentation is just a really interesting place to visit. And so I'll end by saying that beer is, and this is attributed to, what's his name? Ben Franklin. Beer is a sign that God loves us and wants us to be happy.